This week we're going to start with lung development. The 5 stages of lung development are the embryonic stage, the pseudoglandular stage, the canalicular stage, the saccular stage, and the alveolar stage. During the embryonic stage, around day 22, what's called the respiratory system buds out from the foregut. And this is important because the fact that the respiratory system is derived from the gastrointestinal system opens up certain possibilities with respect to abnormal development. So if you have anomalies of the upper GI tract, you may also have anomalies of the respiratory tract because they're derived from the same structures. And if there's a developmental event of some kind that occurs at this stage, roughly 1 month to 6 weeks of development, it could affect both structures simultaneously. So the respiratory diverticulum buds out from the foregut, and then it sort of very shortly thereafter bifurcates. So it divides into 2 sections, and those are called the right and left primary bronchial buds. So now you have your 2 buds, and then at week 5, they branch again. So they branch differently based on which side they're on. So on the right side, you form 3 secondary bronchial buds, whereas on the left side, you form 2 secondary bronchial buds. And those bronchial buds will sort of define the lobes of the lung. So on the right side, you have 3 lobes, and on the left side, you have 2 lobes. From here on out, most of the rest of the development of the lungs involves branching. So lobes that subdivide into progressively smaller and smaller lobules until you terminate in alveoli, and we'll go through what those stages look like. Also, at this stage, we get separation of the trachea and the larynx from the esophagus. So because the respiratory diverticulum is derived from the foregut, it must separate from the gastrointestinal system. Clearly, you don't want a connection between your respiratory system and your gastrointestinal system, although we will talk about what happens when you have one. Okay, next up, from 6 to 16 weeks, you have the pseudoglandular stage, which is really just characterized by continued branching. And what you're forming at this stage are the terminal bronchioles, which are shown here in the green. So there's sort of stalks off of which additional branching will come. From 16 to 28 weeks, you're in the canalicular stage. Again, more branching. The terminal bronchioles will branch into what are called the respiratory bronchioles. And these bronchioles are essentially projections or tubes off of which you're going to have alveoli ultimately. Also in this stage, in the canalicular stage, you start to see vascularization of the mesoderm that's surrounding the developing lung tissue. And that vascularization is going to help support the lung tissue as it develops. Finally, in this stage, we start to see differentiation of the lung epithelium. So the interior lining of the lung starts to differentiate and take on its more mature form. Keep in mind that one of the functions of lungs is to produce amniotic fluid prenatally, but also surfactant, which helps to lubricate the lungs and makes breathing possible. It's one of the reasons that even though, say, a baby at 25 weeks has most of its organ systems fully developed, it doesn't have its lungs fully developed. Lungs are the last thing to mature in a baby, and in fact, they continue to mature after birth. We'll talk about that. But without developing this surfactant, without this period of time during which we're starting to get the differentiation of the cells of the lung epithelium, and we're starting to see production of surfactant, a baby born without that can't survive without help. And even with help, many babies that born at that early stage, 23, 24, 25 weeks, are called micropreemies. Many of them will not survive even with help. Those that do survive often have significant morbidities, challenges as a result of their early birth. Okay, the saccular stage from 28 to 36 weeks. So at this point, we're seeing branching of the respiratory bronchioles into what are called terminal sacs. So we're not going to get further branching out from there. Those are the sacs. And at this point, a baby born in this range may be able to breathe. Okay, there is some functional gas exchange that can occur across, out from the terminal sacs into the surrounding blood vessels and vice versa, although many babies born in this age range will need some sort of respiratory support. And of course, the further along you get, the less likely you are to need it. So a 36-week baby is much less likely to need respiratory support than a 28-week baby. Finally, the final stage is the alveolar stage. Now the terminal sacs have matured into what are called alveoli, which are the final form, the mature form of the terminal ends of the lung buds. And you do continue to see continued branching of the respiratory bronchioles into terminal sacs and then differentiation of terminal sacs into alveoli. And that continues not only up till delivery, but also after delivery and can go on for up to 2 years after delivery. So the lungs really are not fully mature at the time that a baby is born, and a lot of additional differentiation is required. Okay, so getting back to this idea that your lungs and your gastrointestinal system are derived from the same original tube. So it is important that you get proper splitting between the future trachea and the future esophagus. And if you don't, and again that would occur at about 5 weeks, embryonic week 5, if you don't get proper splitting, you have what's called a tracheoesophageal fistula, which is essentially an abnormal connection between the trachea and the esophagus. The problem there is that when you eat, the food that you eat could then go into your lungs, and that's bad for any of a number of reasons. Anytime you've had something go down the wrong tube, you know what that feels like. But if you actually get food particles in your lungs, they can very quickly sort of acquire bacteria and become an infection, which could make you very sick. Now, tracheoesophageal fistula is not a terribly common birth defect, but it occurs in roughly 1 in 3,500 births. But among children with Down syndrome, 1% of those children will have a TE fistula, tracheoesophageal fistula. So it is much more common in certain genetic conditions, Down syndrome being the most common of those. Now, tracheoesophageal fistula often goes along with esophageal atresia, which would make sense. Again, it's all that same developmental timing, the same process is being affected. So esophageal atresia would be when the esophagus is not fully formed, okay, and they're showing you some variations on that in this picture here. And so what you end up with is coming down sort of, if you were to sort of fly through somebody's mouth into the mouth of somebody with an unrepaired tracheoesophageal fistula with esophageal atresia, you would have one blind pouch, which would be the esophagus that did not continue all the way down toward the stomach. And then you'd have your trachea or windpipe, which would continue into the lungs, but which would also have an offshoot which went to the second half of the esophagus, which then went into the stomach. So can you pick this up prenatally? Sometimes, although not always. This is one that may well be missed prenatally. But for babies that have it, you may see polyhydramnios, which is extra amniotic fluid, which makes sense. Particularly if they have esophageal atresia, they can't really swallow amniotic fluid the way that they're supposed to because they've just got a blind pouch. They don't actually have a connection to their stomach. And if they're doing that, then A, we would expect the fluid to be high because they're not able to swallow it back into their system. And B, we would really expect to see a stomach. The way you see a stomach on a prenatal ultrasound is because it's filled with fluid, which makes it look very dark and it's easy to spot. But if it's not filled with fluid, you can't see it. And a baby that can't fill its stomach will have a stomach you can never see by ultrasound. Now, in terms of management of a TE fistula, they always have to be repaired surgically. When these kiddos are born, they tend to have this really sort of intense oral secretion, so this mucus that's sort of coming up out of their mouths. They have trouble breathing. They do vomit a great deal, which makes perfect sense if they're trying to eat and the food can't get to their stomach, or if it's going into their lungs, then they would vomit. They also cough and gag with some frequency.